So now that we've spent all this time configuring our character for Ragdoll, it is about time we actually make use of it. So on screen now you'll see the final render of this project, and we are going to have a look at that scene file and see where Ragdoll was used. So in Houdini, you can see here I have a very simplified sort of scene file. The one you will find in the content library is a bit more involved than this, as in it just builds stuff a little bit more explicit, but the idea is the same. So what I have here is I have our little bot.char, which again I went ahead and just stashed for this particular example. Towards our right we have the pile. So the pile itself, it's an interesting network also. It exists in the content library. We're not going to cover it in this masterclass because it's a little bit of a tangent to what we're talking about. It used Ragdoll, so we used Ragdoll to create the pile, and I think we did it in a quite interesting way that's at least worth exploring further. So if you're interested in that, we made sure to annotate the network so you can have a look in there, and hopefully it all makes sense to you. Afterwards, we have this here Apex CNet prop, as you can see. So in a nutshell, what this does is we just add our pile as a character in our scene. This also has a nice Ragdoll toggle here, so it's going to initialize some stuff for us. Now, because this is used as a prop, it's a lot easier to configure. It's a single control, a single joint, and there's no limits, so we can kind of do this automatically more or less. It's the same algorithm for the shapes as in Ragdoll collision shapes. We just do it in bulk on the whole thing at once. And then here we have the scene animate. Before we jump into the scene animate and show the shot, I want to mention a couple of things. So I went ahead and modified a little bit of the data that we configured at the previous step. And to be more specific, I went ahead and got the limits in the better stage, or at a better step, which of course makes sense because we haven't actually spent very much time configuring those. So if I show you here what I have, let's get the Ragdoll skeleton, put in the configure joint limits, and I'm going to go to guide and display rotation limits. If I zoom in a bit, you can see that we have the ranges looking a bit better, including for the antennas. You will be able to find the exact configuration in the content library. So if you want to follow along, please go and get it there. The next step, or the next little bit that I've changed, is the mapping. So with the mapping, we have a bit of flexibility in terms of how we want to map to the Ragdoll result. And what I mean by that is, let me just quickly show you here. I'm going to turn off map by name because I don't want to see any changes. This will just look at the mapping we already have. So I actually didn't use map by name at all. This is because I didn't want some of the mapping. So for example, the root, I didn't want to be mapped at all. This is because I don't really care about writing the root data back to our character. I want the root to stay in a single place. Next up is I didn't map the hips to the hips, but instead we mapped the hips to the COG. This is a common problem potential problem that we encounter with these kind of things, because if you have a COG control that has no associated joint in our Ragdoll skeleton, we don't really want to write the data out and leave the COG behind, because that will mess up with future animation sort of layering on top of the Ragdoll result. So writing back to the COG is a great way to have the COG follow along with everything else, while still actually getting the motion across. And that's mostly it. For the helmet, I decided to write to the helmet FK directly, not to the lookat. But I do want to make a note here saying that you can actually write to the lookat as well. So the way we do the mapping and then the write up is using a parent constraint. So you can make some interesting sort of pairings between, controls like the lookat, which rely on position, and the helmet joint, which is essentially rotation driven, right? So just know you can do this. It's more a matter of preference. Okay, so that out of the way, let me come back here to our scene animate, go into the state, and have a look through the scene. So by default, as you've seen in the render, we've got our character sort of coming out alive from the pile, coming sort of up on the pile and then jumping and falling to the ground. So Ragdoll was used in this shot mainly for putting the character in its initial spot. So if I come up here and I hide all controls, you can see that our character starts sort of collapsed in the pile, so that it kind of, let me do this as well, so that it's basically a natural part of the pile. Then I went ahead and hand animated him, so all this stuff is sort of keyframes with layers and all of that. You can investigate if you want exactly what's going on in terms of like layer setup and all that stuff in the project files. And then after the whole animation stuff here at the end, we went back to Ragdoll and just blended from animation into Ragdoll so that our character falls and hits the ground. You can also see that the fall itself is a little bit stylized. So it is sort of physically accurate up to an extent, but then we also, because in the Ragdoll tool we have access to a bunch of Ragdoll options, we can also essentially dial in the stylization as much as we want, especially when it comes to gravity forces and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and explore how we could achieve something like this from the get-go. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is I'm going to exit here, and I'm going to drop down another scene animate just to show you the initial step, right? Because dropping the character into the pile, that's already baked into our animation. So the whole animation depends on it. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to reset there. So when we start from scratch, this is what we get. We have our pile and our character at rest position. So what I did is I essentially just grabbed the root, brought our character up somewhere, and I just positioned it in relationship with the rest of the pile, so that when it falls, we are gonna get something that, one, looks convincing, as like our hero is still sort of a part of the pile to begin with, but then at the same time, we wanted a pose or an initial pose that would allow us to have him get out of there later on. So let's see, I'm happy with this. I'm gonna go here straight to Ragdoll. This will place our Ragdoll over there, and the pile C also becomes a Ragdoll character because of that scene add prop. I'm gonna hide the pile Ragdoll for now, because we see the pile itself, and that's good enough. And I'm also gonna go ahead and hide the little bot for now. If we now start playing, we're gonna see our character fall into the pile. Now, you know, there's stuff we can configure already, but for the initial shot, especially since we're planning to animate on top later on, perhaps it's not as useful. The antennas themselves are definitely way too flappy, so we don't exactly want them like that. So we can either choose to not write to the antennas at all, at which point they will just stay in their rest pose. Or if we want some antenna action, then we can already configure that antenna in Ragdoll. So for example, if I select the antenna and then come over here and select the other one, right? So we got these two selected. I'm going to go ahead and just create a set because it's a lot easier to come back to this later on. So we have the Ragdoll antenna. So now if I click on the set, I get the selection. We can press G on our keyboard. You can see all the details up here. Go to Ragdoll, go to animated, and we're going to make our antennas a lot more stiff because right now they're a bit too flappy. So I'm going to turn on match local transforms, which will basically tell the solver that those, or will have the solver try to keep the antennas in their local position. It's kind of like a motor of force applied in the solver if you're familiar with Ragdoll. And then let's increase the stiffness quite a lot to make them way stiffer. Okay, so now if I play, we're gonna see that our antennas stay a bit more together. We can see that they kind of flip around at the base a little bit too much. So I'm going to select the bases as well and do match local and increase the stiffness on those also. And play that. Yeah, something like that looks good. All right, so let's say we start like this and we just drop our character. And the moment we're happy with the pose, so let's say, you know, we're going to go let it cook for a little bit so it's sort of the character gets to settle and get to a point where we're happy. So something like this, which is reasonably close to what we have in the shot as well. And now what we can do is I'm going to come back down here to our animation editor, and we can also see we have a single base animation layer, which is perfect. So I'm going to bring up all of our controls, which you see have stuck up in their initial place. I'm going to select them, do Control G to bring out this little menu. Again, you can see all the details up there. Go to Ragdoll, actions. And then we want to bake these pose into our rig to use it as a starting pose. Now, we can do it on a separate layer, but because this is going to be our starting pose and we're going to animate from here, I'm happy to just bake it on the base layer. So I'm going to turn off bake keys to new layer, and I'm going to do bake keys. You see that this brings all of our controls down to where our character lies, okay? I'm going to now exit Ragdoll and bring our character back. That was a bit of a glitch. So we've got the character in place. You can see it's lying exactly as the Ragdoll did. Now, of course, the only little last bit that we want to clean up before we start animating is that we've written the keys at this frame 150, because that's where our Ragdoll was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my controls, come here to the animation editor, select all the keys, and just move them to frame 1. Okay? So that means that now we have a nice clean start with a frame 1. You can see that they've been put on the base animation layer, and we are good to go. Okay, now I'm going to go back to our original scene animate, just to demonstrate the fall part, because the workflow was basically like this, where we just kind of started with this, the fall, then it was a bunch of like hand keying to get the robot going out of the pile and onto the actual like jump step right here. And then from the jump step, it's back to Ragdoll. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first mute the layers that we already have going. Again, you can see this setup in the project files if you want to investigate a little closer. So if I mute those layers, which are basically the fall and the antennas flapping, if I now play again, you will be able to see that our character the antennas will be stiff. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that the fall just stops there. Okay. And now we can actually go ahead and configure Ragdoll from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Ragdoll. We have the character start in that exact position because we've did a reset of the target animation. If I play, you see that our character actually just doesn't do anything. It just falls to the ground, and that's as expected. I am going to go ahead and hide our little bot for now, and I'm going to keep just the Ragdoll around so we can see what's going on. And what we want is we want to focus on the fall first, all right? So that means that we want our character to follow our animation, but then when it reaches the end point, we want the Ragdoll to take over. So now that's the case. We have the animation up to date. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select just a control in our Ragdoll, like let's say the helmet. I'm going to go to Ragdoll, animated, and just turn off character active, okay? You can see our character turned gray. So now if I just play, you'll see that our Ragdoll character will follow our animation one-on-one. So essentially the solver no longer does anything right now. You just have the character play exactly what the input animation is like. So we can see that it looks correct. We have our character basically all the way up to the jump, and then it just stops. So now what I want to do is I want to get this character I want to get Ragdoll to take over at some point during the fall. Okay, so first things first is I'm going to come back here to frame 1, and we are going to actually key this character active. So I did Alt-click, the same way we would do with a parameter, to key that parameter on frame 1. And then we're going to keep scrolling up to a point where we're happy. So let's say I'm going to come up here, maybe to 216 or 217, and I'm going to select the helmet. I'm going to turn character active on and then key. And now if I scroll a little bit backwards and then forwards, this will cause the solver to start updating from this frame onwards. We can see that we've got the fall, and then our character just goes into Ragdoll and falls to the ground. Okay, so now if I go a bit, let's go to the beginning and have it play just to see if the simulation itself takes on at a decent time and it looks realistic, or at least up to an extent. So we get the fall, and then we see our character lingers a bit in mid-air when it jumps over there. So it seems like the velocity is a little bit awkward at that particular frame, and that's probably because of the way we actually hand animated, and we didn't, get the velocity very accurately. So what we can do is we can come here to global active. I can get if I can figure out where it is, the frame. and move it a bit behind. So let's say we can do it to 215. So we just preserve a little bit more of that initial velocity. So now if I scroll a bit back and then a bit forward, we can see that our character starts flying mid-air a bit quicker. Okay, so I'm going to go a bit back here, the jump, and then there we go. It still seems to be a little bit floaty. So let's say I'm happy with the moment that the jump happens, but we are a bit unhappy about the speed at which our character falls. And now is the time where we can actually start playing about with, like for example, gravity or even the time step in order to move a bit away from that sort of physically accurate result and start introducing a bit of stylization into the process that would just make the shot more to our liking. So we just said I'm not entirely happy with the speed at which our character falls to the ground. So what I'm going to attempt to do from the get-go is get the gravity much higher to something like -20. Now if I scroll a bit back and then let it play from there, we can see that our character will fall a bit quicker. Let's go again from the beginning just to get the timing. All right, so it looks a little bit better, but perhaps I want this increased even more. So let's go, something drastic like -40. Scroll a bit back, and I'm gonna play. Okay, so you can definitely see how our character is sort of being pulled down much faster, and it sort of end up hitting the head on the crate, and that's actually something nice. Perhaps we like this. So let's say we're happy with this for now, okay, and we can sort of keep refining little bits here and there. So one of the bits that we want to perhaps address here is the legs. So you can see that the moment he jumps, the legs go kind of limp and awkwardly forward. So what we can do is we can have our character preserve its initial sort of leg position a bit longer. So one way we could do that is we could come here to a frame where our characters, let's say it's midair. I'm going to select the legs, press G, come to animated, and we are going to get these to match local. So this will make them preserve their pose that goes into Ragdoll for a little bit longer. So now if I, let's say, come here and I play scrub forward, we can see that our legs are a little bit stiffer compared to what they were. They're still a bit too limp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them again and increase the stiffness. So let's try something like 75. Scroll a bit backwards. And now if I play forward, you can see that our legs will now stay a little bit more true to the initial input. And I kind of like this, right? So it sort of swings the legs forward in a more rigid fashion, hits its head onto the crate. And now when it hits the ground, we actually want the legs to go limp again, because otherwise it looks like they've just got sort of stiffened up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them again. We are going to come to the match local and key it. It doesn't matter where, because this is a constant. So we can, safely key it at this frame, and then next frame straight up, I'm going to key it off so that the legs go back to being more limp. So now if I go and play, we can see that our character hits the floor. They're still a little bit stiff, and this is because we got the stiffness quite high. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to where we get into Ragdoll. Select the legs. Actually, we can go probably somewhere around here when before the helmet hits the crate, and key the stiffness. And when we're going to do a couple of frames where we get stiffness to drop back down to 5. Okay. So now if we have a look at our result, we have our character jump, hit the helmet onto the crate, and then as the feet go to the floor, they go back to being a lot more limp. So he just kind of like falls face down into the ground. All right. So let's play all the way from the beginning. He wakes up, goes up. This is all like hand key stuff, and then jumps, hits his head, and falls to the ground. So I'm quite happy with the result. Obviously, there's a lot more we can do here, but you kind of get the gist of sort of art directing the shot and what's going on. Another part that we don't like, of course, again, is the antennas. But I want to address the antennas in just a later step. So I'm just not going to worry about them right now. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to bake this out to our character. Maybe we'll not even bake all the way to the end, just when he falls like face down, something like this. So 245, and we can just, 46, and we can have him come to a sudden stop like we did in our final render. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back my controls for the little bot, and I'm going to select them. I'm actually going to go ahead for the antennas and deselect them, because I don't want to bake to the antennas at all, as we just said. I am going to then scrub back to where our Ragdoll kicks in, which is here. There's no point in baking the whole frame range, because the Ragdoll only really happens after this frame onwards. I'm going to come to actions. We already have bake keys on new layer turned on. I'm going to hit start recording poses, and I'm going to just play through, let our Ragdoll take over, and then we said we want to stop at 246. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop the recording of the poses. I'm going to go back to the animate state now and bring back our character. So now if we play, we can see here that we're actually missing all of our animation up to the point of Ragdoll, okay? And why is this? Well, the reason for this is that by default, the Ragdoll layer that we just created is an override layer, because we're essentially overriding all of the data of our controls. And because we already decided to override from a particular frame onwards, which is, if I come over here and look, frame 215, right? We could have baked the whole range, but it's kind of pointless. What's a bit better to do in this regard is to come here to our Ragdoll layer and set its weight to 0 and key that, okay? I'm going to count all the way to where our actual animation starts, which is again 215. I'm going to count to 214 and key this back to 0. And then to 15, I'm going to just key this back to 1. So what this means is that now we've got our motion playing. So essentially our Ragdoll layer up here doesn't take effect at all, up to the point of 215, where we do want it to take effect mid-jump, right? So we got this, and then the jump, and our character then hits and falls to the ground. Okay, so now if we just play this, let me hide the controls, and let's just play this from the beginning to see if we're happy about it. We get the animation. This was already done, that's fine, and then the jump, right? And we're happy with the motion. Perhaps here at the end, the actual stopping point is a bit abrupt. So we could do something about him still like, fidgeting about a little bit or falling to a side or something like this. But that's something we can animate afterwards ourselves. Either on the same layer, probably I'll just do like another layer and do like the final touches if I wanted to. Because what's really nice to do, of course, now is that because this is all new layer stuff, I could, for example, come here. I could create a new layer. So I'm going to actually just select all my controls, and I'm going to do layer, create layer from selected controls. This by default is additive, so it's not actually going to mess up any of our animation. And I could, for example, come here to frame 215, or actually even further. So let's say up toward the point where our character falls to the ground, so like 242, key everything, so it's all zeroed out to begin with, and then just play a bit through. And we can have something like our COG. We can animate this forward on the side and key it over there. Okay, so now our character will fall face down and then rotate a bit further with the COG. So anyway, stuff like this, you get the point. We can just build layers and layers of data on top of each other, and the Ragdoll just basically fits in wherever in this sort of stack of layers. It's not the end result. It's just a helper tool that can help us get the motion that we want faster and easier, and help us iterate if we want to. Because of course, now, at any point, say I decide to change this, or maybe I don't like this shot at all, and I want to change it for some whatever reason, I can go back to Ragdoll. Okay, I'm gonna hide my bot again just to see what's going on. I could come up here, of course, and change this. Let's say I want even harder gravity, like 80. So, now as it jumps, it falls even harder and goes, going all over the place. So perhaps that's something we want to do now. and we just want to bake this out. So anyway, you get the point. That's how we worked on the fall. So once we're happy with this and we've all baked it out and it's ready to go, the next step I want to touch on, and this is kind of a very similar approach, is just to show the ranges of things that we could do with Ragdoll, is I want to work on the antennas. So let's say I'm all happy with this shot, okay? The Ragdoll layer, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this one so it's a bit cleaner. So we have the Ragdoll layer in place, and that's fine. And I'm going to actually now, because I'm happy with the Ragdoll layer, I'm going to go ahead and reload the animation. And then I'm going to select my Ragdoll controls, come here to wherever we've had any framing done, and remove all keys. And then I'm going to also make sure we just reset everything to defaults, including the gravity. Okay? So now our Ragdoll is back to limp and whatever it was in the beginning. So for the antennas, we don't want to set the character to inactive. We want to set just the body to inactive and keep the antennas active. So I have here a nice selection set. I'm going to click on it, select all the shapes except the antennas, and I'm going to go here to animated and disable active. And this is a similar idea like the character active, it's just that this is per shape, not per whole character. So if I play now, we should see that our antennas are going all over the place, whilst our character is just following our input animation. And you can see that it is actually following the input animation through with the fall also, right? This is because we just reloaded the animation, and now we have that stuff sent through Ragdoll as well. So for the antennas, I'm going to now select them and do the same stuff we did in the beginning, where I'm just going to straight up enable match local and make them a lot stiffer. We can even add a bit more damping so that the ease of rotation is a bit more accentuated. So now if I play, we can see how they are a bit more sort of springly. Perhaps they're still a bit too much. So here, for example, we could also just mess with the time step. So for example, if I get the time step to something like much higher, like 0.06, for example, we can see the result is the period seems to be a bit slower, but it's also sort of a lot of strength in the forces and the way it pushes them. Whilst if I go with something a lot lower and play, you'll see the antennas be a lot sort of stiffer and more springly. Okay? Depends what we're going for. Maybe for the sake of this one, I'm just going to stick to something lower, but let's increase it a little bit. So let's do like a 2.5, like a 2.5, and play. And we can see here, they start going a bit more crazy again. But let's say we're happy with this, okay? Now, one thing is that you see that they do start playing already from where our character stays still. This is not something we want. We want our character to be still to begin with. So there's a few ways in which we can do this. We can either just bake out the whole range of the antennas and then mess with the layer weight to sort of figure out when we want those to kick in. We can also just mess with their activation. So I could, for example, select the Ragdoll antennas, come here to the animate parameters, and I could turn active off and then turn it on, and then turn it on around when the character starts moving. So that would be something like here, like 55, turn it on, and key. So now our antennas will stay put, inactive, and when the character starts moving, they start moving also, right? I prefer it this way and then just write out the ranges where the antennas are actually moving, just to make it a bit easier to manage and not have just more dense data that we don't actually need. And then as usual, we're gonna make them stop or like at the same frame as our character, or maybe we can let them, go a bit further, like 248 or something like this, after our character has fallen. So once we're happy with this, we are going to come here and get the controls up. I'm going to select all the antennas controls, only the antennas, because we only want to bake to them. I'm going to come to the beginning around frame 55 when we have the antennas starting to move. And we're going to go to start recording poses, again to a new layer. That's totally fine. I'm going to start recording poses and I'm just going to play through. And we're going to wait until we get to frame 2 to 48. 48. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now, go outside of Ragdoll, bring back our bot, and now if we hide the controls and start playing, we should see that the antennas get that nice sort of bumpy motion in the animation, in the clip. All right. For this one, you can see that it's the initial stages. Well, the character isn't exactly moving, so that's totally fine. We don't really have to mess much with the weight of the layer because we're happy to overwrite the antennas completely from Ragdoll in this particular scenario. Okay. One thing perhaps we might want to do is just lower the weight here if we feel like the antennas are going too crazy. So we can lower that to 0.5. And now if I play, you should see them a little bit sort of smoother or less crazy as they're playing. And there we go. That's basically the workflow that we used to get this shot done. We did a few iterations and we just sort of picked the one that we liked in the end.